So next in the schedule today, we're going to have a talk by Professor Thomas Dietz, who has as a title, What We Know and What We Need to Know About Climate Decision Making. I'm briefly going to introduce Professor Dietz. Thomas Dietz is a professor of sociology and environmental science and policy at the Center for System Integration and Sustainability at the Michigan State University. Dietz has served as chair of the U.S. National Research Council Committee on Human Dimensions of Global Change and as vice chair of the Committee on Advancing the Science of Climate Change. He has been awarded the Sustainability Science Award from the Ecological Society of America. As a human ecologist and environmental sociologist, his research focuses on the drivers of environmental change and human well-being, on the social psychology of environmental decision-making, and on the interplay between science and values in decision-making. So without further delay, welcome, Professor Dietz.
I really want to thank the organizers for putting together what is, I think, one of the most amazing events that I'm aware of, bringing together so many different perspectives on this critical issue around climate change. And I want to lament and celebrate the fact that we're not together in Montreal. I'll celebrate it because we have very low carbon footprints compared to what we would have if we were actually physically there together in Montreal. I'll also celebrate the fact that this allows for much more equitable and diverse participation in the meeting. But of course, one has to lament a little bit the loss of synergy, of serendipity, and of being able to celebrate one of the world's great cities. But as with all things, and that's one of the themes of my talk, there are trade-offs that one has to make in deciding about these things. In some ways, COVID imposed this restriction on us. But in the future, I think we will be having to make those trade-offs and deciding what value weight do we give to each of those features of a meeting, whether in person or online, in deciding how to go forward with meetings in the future. So with that, again, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about climate decision-making in a broad context. There we go. What I'm going to talk about is derived from a book that is right now out for review at a couple of publishers that's on sustainability and decision making. So I'm going to talk about sustainability, but most of my work actually has been on climate change. And in particular, I'm going to focus more on chapter 3, how we make decisions and the grand traditions of theories of decision making and empirical work on decision making. And you've already heard a great deal about that already from Susan and Baruch, who have both contributed to one important line of those traditions. I'll say a little bit about reform versus transformations and how we influence decisions as individual decisions and how we influence the conversation, which is my way of talking about influencing collective decisions. And my real goal here is to offer some thoughts about how all the rich materials you've been hearing across the summer school and will continue to hear into next week might be brought together, some things to think about that might help you for synthesis. So I'm going to talk about what is a good decision and why do we have conflicts. Then the 3 big traditions in decision making, the rational actor model, the heuristics and biases tradition, and social psychology, where I'll emphasize the values, beliefs, norm theory, and the role of altruism and self-interest. I'll talk a little bit about how we might influence decisions given what we know about all those things. And then I'm going to talk about how we might frame the issues of climate and cognition. They've already come up in the questions I've seen across this morning. And so these are just some thoughts about things that may be useful to think about in that context. So here are the 3 things that I'm going to say that I know absolutely are correct without hesitation. First of all, much of what I've said you have already heard, not only today, but across other sessions. But repetition can be useful. Second, I'm sure that a good bit of what I have to say will be wrong, but sometimes if you think about why I'm wrong, you'll learn something from that. And finally, something that comes up a lot in discussions of climate change, climate policy, and any sustainability policy is this idea that the best is the enemy of the good. There is often a tension between solutions that can solve the whole problem and solutions that are only an incremental part of the problem. And I think that sometimes applies to our research as well, that sometimes a piece of research doesn't give us all the answers, but it does make some contributions. So keep in mind that the best can be the enemy of the good. Baruch raised the issue of our institutions not being very well set up to support the kinds of work we need to do. And Donald Stokes posed this by talking about the tension between a quest for fundamental understanding in our scholarship and considerations of being useful. And what I've added to Stokes's original diagram, we'd like to do both, but the disciplines tend to push us away from being useful, seeking their own interests. And stakeholders, those who want us to be useful, can sometimes push us away from the quest for fundamental understanding. Stokes argued that Niels Bohr occupied the upper left, where he was creating fundamental understanding, but his work per se was not intended to be useful. While Thomas Edison was very interested in being useful, but didn't contribute all that much to fundamental knowledge. And what I want to point out in exactly this domain of the social sciences applied to sustainability, we have sterling examples of people who have managed to be both, who have occupied what Stokes calls Pasteur's quadrant, who have been major contributors to fundamental understanding, who have also managed to figure out how to do their work in a way that is useful to those who have to solve real world problems. So we can look at Ed Miles and particularly Lynn Ostrom as inspirations in this regard. So let me talk a little bit about decisions and conflicts. First of all, I think it's important to keep in context climate change is part of a whole set of global environmental changes, alteration of biogeochemical cycles, biodiversity loss, wide dispersion of toxic, persistent toxics. But those sort of emerging challenges are also embedded and connected with the old challenges that we've been facing since the emergence of agriculture, settlements, and social stratification, violence, inequality, bias and discrimination, pandemics. And while we sometimes need to do analyses that look at one set of these or one subset of these problems in isolation, we have to realize that they're all interacting with each other. One also hopes that what we're learning in dealing with climate change and global environmental change more generally will help us learn processes and approaches that'll help us deal with the emerging challenges around new technologies, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, cognitive technology. So I just want to remind us of this larger picture. So sustainability and decisions. My working definition of sustainability is not the Brundtland definition, but it's an argument that sustainability is about trying to enhance the well-being of humans and other species while reducing harm to the environment. So already we have two goals, and that will usually involve us in trade-offs. We have to engage facts and values to make decisions. And I think that's one of the reasons that sometimes we get frustrated because we're not making change fast enough, because we sometimes forget that there are real value conflicts out there. That is, people will differ not only in their beliefs, in their assessment of what the facts are, but also in their values. We have good cultural mechanisms for trying to come to agreement about facts, i.e. science. That's really what science is. We don't always use them very well, but we know what to do even if we don't do it very well, and even when there's active manipulation around beliefs. But our values are closely related to our identity. So value differences are very challenging, and we don't have as good a set of mechanisms to debate them. So if I say to you, particularly in this context, you just asserted a fact about how people make decisions about climate change, I think you're wrong, and here's why. That's normal scientific discourse. You may be a little threatened by that, but it's part of what we do as scientists. If I say to you, yeah, I heard you argue in favor of that particular policy, your values are all screwed up. That's a very threatening statement to make to someone. And so we always have to keep in mind that we're dealing always with facts and values when we're trying to decide on courses of action or make decisions. And that there's a tendency when values are in conflict to try to reframe the conflict as about facts so we don't have to deal with difficult value conflicts. So I mentioned that twofold trade-off. When we move to something like the Sustainable Development Goals, we've now got 17 good things that we'd like to accomplish. And there certainly can be positive synergies across these, but sometimes there'll be conflicts as well. So again, we have to think about trade-offs and conflicts and value differences. I also want to note that the SDGs, which were developed to a large extent by building on the capabilities approach to ethics of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. So the goal of, according to the capabilities approach of our action should be to enhance what people and other species are actually able to do and to be. And my point here is that ethical theories underpin policy analysis, and we often need to be much more explicit about the kind of ethical theories we're bringing to bear. That we're kind of ignoring an important part of the discussion if we don't think about the ethical theories as well as the facts. Why do I emphasize this distinction between facts and values so much? Well, I would say beware the information deficit model. Many experts still hold the view that if we get consensus on the facts, then conflicts will be resolved. If the public, that is, or political officials knew what I know, they would do the right thing, which is what I think they should do. Often this is accompanied by underappreciation of the uncertainties involved in assessing the facts in a particular, often local community context. But while getting the facts right is important and sometimes leads to sound decisions, there are usually also value differences, and they often are the real source of disagreement around climate or sustainability in general. In those cases, focusing exclusively or even primarily on the facts is a distraction. The values beliefs norm model that I'll come to later in the talk emphasizes the interplay of facts and values. And it's in part for this reason that I emphasize it, and in fact, why we've worked on this approach. Deliberative processes that I'll discuss below are especially intended for us to have this kind of discourse around facts and values in a way that is respectful of both. And by the way, on the information deficit model, this report from the US National Academy of Sciences, Communicating Science Effectively, it's about 2 years old, 3 years old now, has a nice summary of the literature indicating why the information deficit model is usually incorrect. Okay, so the three big traditions of decision-making. First, we have the rational actor model. The rational actor model assumes that we maximize utility subject to constraints. The usual assumption in most versions of it is that we act on narrow self-interest, and that can lead to the tragedy of the commons, which I'll come back to in a moment. The influence of others in the rational actor model is captured primarily by the market, that there are social influences, but they're in the market and they're reflected in prices, and that's pretty much all we need to know about what other people are up to. The RAM is, of course, dominant in economics and in most forms of policy analysis, but it's influential everywhere in the social sciences, really. It's intimately linked to utilitarian ethical theory, the idea that the best thing to do is to provide the greatest good to the greatest number, to increase the average utility. The reason for this linkage is that the theory argues that in a perfect market, and this is precisely specified in most microeconomics textbooks, the aggregation of individual choices in the market into prices gives us a measure of social value. So in terms of making decisions, if you really believe that we have perfect markets and people are rational actors, then those prices really are social values. And you can use them in benefit cost policy analysis to reflect social value under utilitarian ethical theory. This, of course, has many limits. And I want to note that some economists are amongst the most deep and articulate critics of some of these core assumptions I've just mentioned. And people are working hard on how to get around some of these limits while still maintaining the utilitarian ethical theory and the rational choice model, at least some of its core. Another key part of the theory is that people's preferences, what it is we are going to choose in order to maximize our utility, are given. It's outside the domain of the rational actor model. And under this approach, if you want to bring about social change, then you want to change people's incentives. And the simplest way to do that, the most effective way under this theory to do that, is to change prices. So this leads to the argument for cap and trade, for carbon taxes, for payment for ecosystem services as well. So that's the RAM tradition. A second tradition I'm going to call heuristics and biases. Susan provided a great overview of this in her talk this morning. We have, it seems, two roughly decision-making processes: fast, which is also called system 1, and slow, which is called system 2. Slow can be rather like the rational actor model. Fast decision-making is done by individuals using heuristics and biases, and it's very common. It's highly efficient when decisions have to be quick. It's probably worked well for most of human history and works reasonably well in our day-to-day lives, but it has some flaws. We often get numbers and probabilities wrong. Again, Susan gave a number of examples of this. We're prone towards biased assimilation and motivated reasoning. Again, she mentioned this. We use our prior beliefs more than new evidence to decide on whether or not to accept new assertions of fact. That is, if we were Bayesians, we give really heavy weight to our priors and really little weight to new information. And under the heuristics and biases, our values influence our acceptance of the facts. So there's a process called solutions bias. You reject facts based on how you feel about solutions that will be proposed. I don't want higher gas prices, so I don't think climate change is real. That is, my values about not wanting higher gas prices filter what information I accept. Baruch noted that Newt Gingrich, the infamous US politician, actually invoked what amounts to the solutions bias in his discussion about climate change. So overall, under the heuristics and biases situation, we're very prone to suboptimal decisions, and it's easy to make mistakes. This is one of my favorite examples of how this matters at the micro level. This is a study by Shaz Atari on which I wrote a commentary. This is the actual energy used or saved by various actions in the household. And this is in a survey of perceptions of how much energy is used or saved. I note to you that this is a log scale. So each of this much change is an order of magnitude. And the problem is that people way underestimate the amount of energy used or saved by the things that are really the big energy users in the household. So if somebody decides they're going to do something to be more energy efficient, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they're likely to see things down here that have relatively modest impacts as being equivalent to the things up here that have big impacts. And so despite their best intentions, they will make a decision that's sort of suboptimal in terms of what they might be able to accomplish. I should note that Shaz's work also points out that experts, even experts in household energy consumption, have to actually work rather carefully to get these answers right. It's not intuitive even to them. And she's also pointed out, and this parallels the kind of ideas that Susan was offering, that if you're careful about providing information, relatively simple information provision can correct some of these biases, but they do exist. And this is a case where incorrect understanding of the facts really matters a lot, okay? What happens when we have to move to think in groups, when we have to make collective decisions? In addition to the biased assimilation that I've just talked about, we have a process called homophily. We tend to associate with and listen to those who think like we do and avoid very strongly those who think differently from us. If you put together biased assimilation with homophily, this leads to groups, cliques, if you will, where everyone in the group thinks alike, and groups grow more and more different from each other over time. All of this points out to something I'll mention once or twice later, that in all of this work, while we often tend to think about isolated individuals, it's crucial to understand social networks and how they influence our decision-making and our actions. So this is just a couple of examples of bias assimilation and homophily. And I think you've seen these graphs like this actually by people who are much more expert than I am in this over the course of this week. In the US, we see an increasing polarization in opinion on climate change across political parties over time. This is the US Congress. This is a score of how pro-environmental votes have been in the House and Senate, with Democrats here and Republicans here. And you see about 1980, which is when US politics on the environment really took a radical turn with the election of Ronald Reagan and a sort of Republican revolution, you begin to see this big divergence between Democrats and Republicans. This is another representation of Congress, the Senate, the House, Democrats, Republicans. This is a measure of ideology and voting. This is over time from 73, 74, 93, 94, 11 and 12. What you see is the Democrats have stayed about the same. Some of the more conservative Democrats, there are fewer conservative Democrats, if you will, while the Republicans have sort of cleared out this space of the moderate space and shifted entirely to the right. So this is this combination of biased assimilation and homophily at work. So on to networks again. It's clear that networks are immensely important to the kind of social processes that influence decision-making. This is from a study I did with Adam Henry and others of the Environmental Policy Network in Washington, D.C. Happily, there's a lot of really good work applying network concepts and methods to issues of sustainability. And I want to plug here a course by Adam Henry, who was one of the major figures in using networks to understand sustainability, that's going to be taught this July at the University of Singapore, but of course online. So if you're looking for another online course and have the time this summer, I highly recommend this to you. Okay, then on to the social psychological approach to decision making, and in particular to values, beliefs, norms theory. Values, beliefs, norms theory is grounded in a consideration of altruism and other values. And it's one of the most commonly used approaches in the study of environmental decision-making within social psychology. VBN was really developed because of a recognition that altruism versus self-interest is a central issue in all studies of behavior. It's an issue for all living things, including plants. And it's now even important in some considerations of interactions between software packages or AIs. Under the rational actor model, it's nearly always assumed that everyone is narrowly self-interested. There are some exceptions. There are things like conjoint utility functions, but generally the RAM assumes narrow self-interest. And that's been true since Adam Smith. Under natural selection shaping genes and genes shaping behavior, sociobiology, if you will, altruism will evolve only under very special circumstances, such as group selection, i.e. what happens with social insects like ants or bees, or in the evolution of multicellular organisms where all the cells in an organism share the same fate. So you can have altruism under genetic evolution, but it's pretty unusual. However, if natural selection and other dynamics are shaping culture, and culture is shaping behavior, which is certainly true for humans, and it's true to a large degree for a number of other species, then it turns out when you do the analysis, altruism should not be rare, although the scope of altruism, how widely we extend our altruistic actions, can be an issue. But my point here is altruism versus self-interest is a core issue. Some people tend to dismiss altruism amongst humans, but in fact, if you believe that our behavior is shaped at least as much or more by our culture as by our genes, then there's every reason to expect a reasonable degree of altruism in at least some people. So why does altruism versus self-interest matter for sustainability? Because narrow self-interest leads to what's called the tragedy of the commons. And I assume probably everybody has heard of the tragedy of the commons. The same kind of logic also applies to prisoner's dilemma, to the problem of collective action, to social traps. Each of these is kind of the way different disciplines have formulated this problem. There are slightly different nuances, but it's the same general problem. And I'll go back to the tragedy of the commons. Suppose we have a village that shares a grazing land. If everyone puts out 3 sheep a year, the grazing land is perfectly sustainable and will stay in good shape for generations. However, if people begin to put out more sheep, the grazing land over a season or two will collapse. So if I'm narrowly self-interested, I'll realize that if I only put out 3 sheep and my neighbors put out more sheep, they get, at least for a short period of time, the benefit of the multiple sheep. I only get the benefit of 3 sheep, and the commons, the grazing land, collapses anyway. So the rational thing for me to do, unless I trust my neighbors not to do the self-interested thing, is to put out more sheep. And so what Hardin argued in his very flawed essay is that the tragedy of the commons is inevitable, that we will always have these common pool resources collapse. And of course, climate is perhaps the ultimate common pool resource, since greenhouse gas emissions emitted anywhere in the world contribute to global climate change. So you get no special benefit for reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. And if no one else does it, your effort is wasted. So what we've learned about this argument about the tragedy of the commons is that it's basically wrong. It's a nice, compelling logic, but it's not what goes on in the real world, at least not in every case. And I would argue that if you've read The Tragedy of the Commons, you need to right away go read work by Lynn Ostrom or Bonnie McKay, or I misspelled Bonnie's name, apologies there, or many others who have actually worked very hard on this. Lynn Eleanor Ostrom, as you know, won the Nobel Prize for her work on commons. There's a nice compendium that Lynn led about 15 years ago called The Drama of the Commons, where we tried to move away from the idea of a tragedy. And what comes out of this literature is that governance of a commons is always a complex hybrid of community, of government, and of markets. The pure forms, which Hardin talks about, exist only in theory. They're not what's actually governing commons in the real world. Solutions that allow you to manage a commons sustainably over long periods of time are hybrids that are designed for a specific context. And this overly complicated diagram on the right is an example of how Lynn thought through how you design effective governance mechanisms for a commons. There are diagnostic questions that help you understand the particular context you're working with, and then design principles that are sort of good ideas that need to be instantiated in particular contexts. And so the conclusion of the literature that's looked empirically is that many commons, including the ones that Hardin used as examples, have been managed successfully by communities for decades or centuries. I should note that this literature exemplifies Susan's point in the questions and answers on the importance of using multiple methods. This literature has historical case studies, laboratory experiments, mathematical models, pretty much everything, ethnographic work, everything you can think of. But this is why self-interest versus altruism matters, because if you only have narrow self-interest, it's very difficult to get away from the tragedy of the commons. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the idea of values. Terms like values and norms are often used rather informally in these discussions, but they are defined theoretically in the literatures I'm trying to cover, and so you have to be a little careful about that. So I'm going to focus on values, which are core orientations that are relatively persistent over the life course and that indicate to an individual what's important to her or him or them. There's an extensive literature on values in this social psychological tradition. The most prominent paper has over 19,000 citations. So you get a sense that there's been a lot of work on this methodologically and empirically. And what emerges is that there are roughly 6 value types, which I have highlighted down below, that seem to occur consistently across many different contexts. When I say different contexts, I really mean different countries and subpopulations within those countries. So how highly individuals rank each of these value types differs a lot across individuals and across countries. And that's what the diagram on the right is showing you, variations across countries and some of the more important value types. But the structure, if you will, the factor structure, if you think about it in terms of data analysis, seems to be fairly consistent. I should note that terms used for these value types differ a little bit across the authors, but it's not too hard to unpack. So when we look at sustainability decision-making, where there again have been hundreds of papers that have used these concepts to see what seems to drive many aspects of sustainability decision-making, including a substantial literature on aspects of climate change, what we find as being consistently important in almost every study is altruism directed towards other humans, biospheric values, which is sometimes called biospheric altruism, which is altruism towards other species in the environment, and egoistic values, self-interest. So that basic contrast I was talking about. We sometimes find that traditional values, sort of honing to how things have been, and hedonistic values, caring about pleasure and comfort, matter. Another major value type found everywhere, I should have put it bold, is openness to change. It turns out that even though one can think about new technologies like solar or electric cars, and one might think that openness to change would have an influence on people's interest in those things, it doesn't seem to matter much in most of the studies that have been done. And there's an emergent value that's sort of engagement with animals, having animals as other species as part of your life, that does seem to predict sustainability actions or sustainability decisions, but it's a fairly new concept and not that well developed. So these are just a couple diagrams to give you a sense of this literature. So this is a scale where people over here tend to be highly traditional, people here tend to be more open to change. Those tend to be polar opposites, and people down here are altruistic, people up here are self-interested. And this is just plotting those 2 dimensions, openness to change versus openness to change versus traditionalism and self-interest versus altruism for a sample in the US. This is pointing out that people's invocation of values can vary from situation to situation. So you may find some people who are always very consistently self-interested or always very consistently altruistic. But for other folks, the definition of the context may allow them to shift. So if I'm talking about selling a car and I'm selling it to a stranger, I may be here highly self-interested. But if I'm talking about selling a car to a neighbor or relative, I may be much more altruistic about it. So individuals can vary from time to time. Although what we found is that values are pretty persistent over the life course. Okay, so values, beliefs, norms theory argues that there's sort of this causal chain, and there's, again, a huge amount of work, about 5,600 cites to the most prominent paper, arguing that we can think about altruism and other values as leading to behavior as either a citizen or as a consumer. And so the theory invokes values at the core. They influence everything, but they themselves are rather hard to change. Values are closely related to personal identity. In the causal chain, we see those as influencing, both values and identity as influencing your beliefs, which gets at motivated reasoning or biased assimilation, that your values are influencing your assessment of the facts, and also trust, which we think of as a particular kind of belief. Awareness and of consequences and ascription of responsibility are specific aspects of the theory of altruism. I'm not going to get into them, although they're important in the theory. And that leads to norms, and norms are hugely important. So in the literature, we talk about several kinds of norms. There are personal norms, which is what I think I should do as a good person. There are descriptive norms, which is what I think other people are doing. And there are prescriptive norms, which is what I think other people think I should do. All three of those kinds of norms can have a huge influence on people's behavior, and they're fairly easy to invoke and fairly easy to change. Somewhere in the questions, I think for Susan's talk, somebody invoked the Cialdini studies about encouraging people to reuse towels in a hotel room. And Bob Cialdini, who's a guru of this field, did a very good set of studies where he showed the most effective way to change that behavior is to tell people in the hotel room on those little signs that you've all seen, how many people who have stayed in this hotel have actually done this. Despite the fact that we know that that's the most effective appeal, the only hotel I've ever seen using that appeal was actually in Montreal. So there's this issue of we know what's a good thing to do in terms of the science, but it doesn't get done. There have also been a lot of studies on using norms, reporting back to people what their neighbors are doing in changing behavior around energy consumption. So that's where the leverage exists. I covered all that. So what comes out of VBN theory is if you want to change behaviors in the short term, influence people's norms. If you want to have a broader influence and have big changes across cohorts, influence their values, but that's harder to do in a slower process. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. It's just that we know, even from research on the pandemic, that altruism is, well, I'll just quickly look at this. This is propensity to wear a mask. And we asked people, are you worried about impacts on your personal health? And this is after controlling for a bunch of other variables. And we see there's a very modest and in fact, negative relationship to wearing a mask. We ask people how worried they are about the impact on the world of COVID, and we get the same kind of results if we ask about your neighborhood, your community, your nation. And that very strongly predicts wearing a mask. So there's a lot of papers now coming out on this where a lot of the protective behavior people undertook during the pandemic were actually driven by concern with other people, not protection of their own health. Each of the three theoretical traditions has a lot to contribute, and my view is that they complement each other. We want to have a symphony blending these theories together rather than some sort of battle of the bands of which theory is right and which theory is wrong. For example, values, beliefs, norm theory can be thought of as explaining the preferences that shape rational actor model decisions. As I mentioned, the rational actor model doesn't actually consider what preferences are, it takes them as given. It also allows, VBN also allows for some of the processes of fast decision making in that we allow values and identity to shape how people assess facts. Within social psychology, there are a number of other important theories of environmental social psychology, notably the theory of planned behavior. And for situations that involve new technologies and practices, the theory of diffusion and innovation. We try to view these as complements. For example, we found that each of those three theories, that is VBN, the theory of planned behavior, and the theory of diffusion of innovations, contributes to our understanding of why homeowners might opt for residential solar. And this immensely complicated table is not worth parsing in detail. This is actually only half of the table, but it's a study where we try to look at interest in residential photovoltaics using all three theories, and again, found that each of the three makes some contribution to understanding. So you're going to have a more robust understanding of why people might be willing to undertake this action by using all three theories rather than thinking that they somehow are in competition with one another. So my general point is our work will advance most quickly and be most useful if we can find ways to integrate and synthesize. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about what we can extract from these theories about influencing decisions. Okay, so if you look at the rational actor model, what you want to do is get the incentives right. So probably the most common approach in the policy literature, in particular, get the prices right. But we know that the impact, the elasticity, the price elasticity of various incentives to, for example, reduce greenhouse gas emissions can vary by an order of magnitude with the same price incentives, depending on how a program is implemented. And if you just look at incentives and prices to change behavior, there can be big equity impacts. So we have to ask, whose incentives? There's the classic problem, for example, of renters who don't have the option to opt for high efficiency, low greenhouse gas emission equipment. Low-income houses who may not be able to afford it and cannot afford to respond to the price incentives. So the price incentives are just an extra burden on them. Water heaters. Usually when your water heater fails, you buy the water heater that's on the plumber's truck. You're not making that decision, the plumber is. Auto dealership, there's an argument that auto dealerships steer people away from electric vehicles because electric vehicles are low maintenance and auto dealerships make a lot of money off vehicle maintenance. So when you think about price incentives, you have to think about who's influential in the decision-making process and what kind of constraints people face. Also, price incentives can be hard to put into place. In jargon, I'll come back to it, they have low initiative feasibility. While, as someone pointed out, BC has had a carbon tax for a long time and very successfully. Just south in Washington State, a carbon tax has failed on a ballot initiative. It can be hard to change these incentives because people immediately see their pocketbook being hit and are resistant, and in some cases for good equity reasons. If we invoke values, beliefs, and norms theory, we know that in some circumstances, people's beliefs matter, and getting those right can make a difference. The example from Atari of people being ill-calibrated about household energy use. But usually in the short term, we want to focus on norms, and as I said a moment ago, and on changing values for the long term. Nudges and defaults can help us overcome heuristics and biases. And we learned from Susan's talk, amongst others, that targeted information can make a difference. And targeted information at the time of decision can be very helpful, not just sort of in the atmosphere, but actually at the point in time and actually at the place where people are making decisions. Setting default options so the default option is a good thing can be useful. We want to make the good choices more visible and so on. So I think nudges and defaults, setting defaults play an important role. But for all the above, all these interventions into trying to change people's behavior, we want to know who's involved in designing the policy or program. And what I'm going to advocate in a little bit is that you always want to get the people who will be affected by the program involved in the design of the program. So now let me turn to influencing the conversation, which is the ways the US society makes decisions. So the rational actor model focuses on, have we got the prices right? Again, markets aggregate individual preferences into prices that allocate resources. So we could use prices as a mechanism for making decisions. But the problem with this is inequality, things where there are no price or where the price is not a reasonable reflection of social value. So yeah, markets make decisions for us, but there are a lot of flaws in those decisions when we think about climate change and other aspects of sustainability. Voting is of course the ideal in most democracies, but the way we do it is we vote for representatives who then engage in deliberation. For the US, I think there's a very serious problem of scale. When the US Constitution was formed in 1790, one member of the US House of Representatives represented about 35,000 citizens, a small town. And so one can imagine some real connection between that representative and many, at least, of the citizenry. Now in the US, typically one member of the US House represents 700,000 citizens. And so the idea that there's some kind of close connection between the citizens being represented in the representative is very much attenuated. So in addition to this, with voting, we have problems of unequal power in the electoral process, the homophily and biased assimilation I've talked about before, which creates polarization where groups aren't talking to each other, and no real reasoned discourse. So what I advocate, my own ethical stance on this, is that we need to have deliberative processes. Deliberation is a structured discourse to try to come to a decision. We know, and I'll talk about this a bit more, that deliberative processes can be highly successful at local to regional levels. The problem is scaling this up to national levels and for climate change to international levels. I've been involved in a little bit of work arguing for the need for deliberative processes, for example, to look at solar radiation management, so-called geoengineering. And there, we clearly need to have global deliberations on this, but it's a little unclear how we would go about doing that. So one of the things that's come out of a whole series of studies by academies of science, the Canadian Council of Academies and the US National Academies of Sciences, is that the best way to use science in making decisions is to embed science in this kind of deliberative processes. The idea is that you have an iterative, ongoing process that's co-designed by everybody involved in the process. The goal is to get the science right. That is, community expertise can help figure out what's going on in local and particularistic contexts and get the science right. But this process also helps get the right science. It figures out how to address issues that are really on the agenda of the interested and affected parties, as well as on the scientific agenda. And the whole process builds trust in science. So the idea is that we would have ongoing deliberation with interested and affected parties and the research community. The goal is to effectively meld facts and values to guide decisions, to allow beliefs and values to evolve, and to build trust and confidence. Reports from academies of science that have suggested this approach. This is on wild horse and burrow management in the US West, climate change, gene drives, human genome editing, solar radiation management. And this one is a fairly recent report from the Council on Canadian Academies on integrated natural resource management that again argues for this kind of deliberative approach. Well, does this work? It's one thing to say it's a nice idea to have everybody talking, but does really anything good come of this? So we did a fairly substantial study. It's dated now. It needs to be redone. Baruch referred to it in his talk this morning, where we reviewed 1,000 studies of public participation processes in the US. Because of which agencies funded it, it was US centric. We also synthesized large families of case studies, and we looked at the gray literature as well as the peer-reviewed literature. And after looking at all this, the National Academies concluded, when done well, public participation improves the quality and legitimacy of decisions and builds the capacity of all involved to engage in the policy process. So you really achieve three goals. You get better quality decisions or assessments. They're more legitimate. And in addition, you're building capacity for everybody involved. Again, what we looked at were studies that were local, what we looked at were studies of participation efforts that were local to regional. So we still need to figure out how to do this on the national and global level. I would argue that this need for diversity of inputs applies to science itself. Science doesn't advance because we're geniuses or saints. Science advances because the process overcomes the flaws and foibles in our individual decision-making process and in our group decision-making process. It takes time and it involves false steps, but there is progress towards more accurate assessment of facts. The process requires diversity. It works best when we have diversity in the disciplines involved, which is something we've all been talking about, in personal backgrounds, the perspectives people bring in gender identity, race, ethnicity, social class, and so on. And for sustainability problems, it helps to have several forms of expertise, not just scientific expertise, in the conversation. So I've argued that if you're going to have a deliberation around sustainability, you need to have scientific expertise about the substance involved. That's pretty straightforward. It's useful to have scientific expertise about process and decision-making, the kinds of expertise that Baruch was referring to in terms of decision sciences, but also on participation. Community expertise, which is what I've been talking about, the people who are interested in and affected by a decision, and that includes traditional ecological knowledge. I've argued that we need political expertise, which is knowledge about the conflicts, assumptions, trust, informal institutional arrangements, et cetera, that help you figure out what's really feasible to do in a particular situation. And then value expertise. Everybody has legitimacy with regard to bringing their values to bear on a decision, but a good process and research can help articulate values and reduce conflict. And there are people who are expert in helping people sort of articulate their values and think through the implications of their values for particular situations. Okay, so
you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So in terms of framing climate and cognition, the first thing I would say, and I'll go quickly over these, is it's very important in figuring out what you want to study, what you want to think about, to look at the things that actually have a major impact. And we have argued that you need to take account of 3 things. The technical potential is often studies. It's how much change occurs if something is universally adapted. So if I buy an electric vehicle, how much does that reduce my carbon footprint? But then you have to think about behavioral plasticity. What proportion of people are actually likely to take that action under some particular set of circumstances? And then finally, initiative feasibility. How likely is it that you can put in place initiatives to encourage the behavior, that is to increase the behavioral plasticity? Too many analyses stop with just technical potential, and some studies and advocacy campaigns ignore even that. And one of the things we always are pushing at amongst our colleagues in psychology is don't study trivial behaviors. Study the things that really matter. Study the big impact behaviors. I'll skip over this, but what this basically shows is that if you only look at technical potential, you'd say the most important things to do in the US for climate change is to look at fuel efficient vehicles, carpooling, trip chaining, and driving behavior, because those potentially have the biggest impact. But if you look at how hard those things are to change, you would shift your priorities. You'd keep efficient vehicles as a policy priority, but you'd look at weatherization appliances and HVAC equipment as your immediate targets, because those are relatively easy to change rather than other things. I'll also note that these kinds of individual behavioral changes, our estimate is could reduce US emissions pretty quickly within less than 10 years by 7.4%, which is 1.6% of global emissions. Is that a solution to the climate problem? No, but I would argue it is a contribution. Okay, I think So we need to think about frequently performed behaviors that have high impact, such as food consumption and travel. But remember, the context matters. The emission from kilowatt of electricity in Kentucky in the US is 100 times that of what my impact here is in Vermont, for which I have to thank Hydro-Quebec while acknowledging that hydro has other environmental and social justice issues involved. And that individual differences matter a lot in looking at individual behavior. We also want to target infrequent but high impact behaviors such as home, vehicle, and large appliance purchases. We need to do much more in looking at organizational decisions, including government and the private sector. They have huge impacts per se, and they set constraints in which other decisions are made. So this has really been under-researched. We need more research outside the weird countries. I think that goes without saying. And we need to be attentive to differentials in social and economic power. The most important decisions and actions are probably those we make as citizens and activists rather than as consumers. And the biggest impact we may have as consumers is not so much through our personal ecological footprint, although that can be important, but to change supply chains by signaling to producers what the issues are and what we're concerned about. Okay, there is a debate in some of the literature on reform versus transformation. So there's a lot of work on individual and household consumer action, and there's now criticism that looking at individuals and consumers is a distraction because such actions cannot solve the climate problem. Only a transformation of the system can. That's true, but let's look at this a little more carefully. First of all, individuals act as citizens and activists. So unless one has a mechanical view of human history, individual agency matters. So the interesting question, I think, for theory and empirical research is, does one kind of consumer action encourage or discourage another? If I buy an electric vehicle, am I more or less likely to reduce meat consumption? And also, how does consumer action influence political action? Does that electric vehicle make me more or less concerned about government policy? At a larger level, how do reforms now reduce or increase the likelihood of transformation in the future? Note that if reforms actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they're reducing risks. There is a time risk trade-off that Susan noted in waiting for transformation. And it's crucial, but often neglected in some of these debates, to think about diversity and variances. Some companies use every tactic available to resist reduction in fossil fuel use. Some come along with reductions in fossil fuel use because they think it is short-term advantageous are long-term profitable for change, and some companies are strongly committed to sustainability. There is variation. So I'm going to close with this, a reminder that facts and values matter. In 2005, the Detroit Zoo decided that it was not appropriate for them to keep elephants who need social groups to fulfill their capabilities. So they retired the 2 elephants they had to a California animal sanctuary. That was very controversial because elephants are among the most popular animals at zoos, and other zoos were very upset that the Detroit Zoo had set this precedent. My point is that the decision required an analysis and deliberation about facts and values. They're the facts about what elephants need for their social life to achieve their capabilities, and the facts about the popularity of elephants and their contribution to programming and revenue. The values were about the zoo as an agent of conservation and education, and about the well-being of the elephants. So the decision required considering the facts and weighing the values, and so do all important decisions. And with that, I will stop. And I think I need to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Yes, thank you a lot, Professor Dietz.